deserve just yet. And well, one thing I need to note is that it's 11 o'clock your time. It's 8 o'clock my time. So it's a bit. If I slide away a little bit, please be forgiving because it's evening in my part of the world. First of all, congratulations to everyone on this day. Belated congratulations. It is an important date, so we can talk about various successes and setbacks of Azerbaijan Democratic Republic, but this day is an important day, and this is also important for enabling us to come together and reflect on various topics that connect us whether we want or not. Right, so we will always be pigeonholed as Azerbaijanis. We can run away from it, but we can also embrace it. So that's a funny way of putting it. Let me go ahead. So with a short, well, I will try to keep it short. I'll present some reflections, notes about ADER and parallels with the current challenges, and I will try to raise some points for discussion. So let me first present, and then we can follow up with questions and discussion. And I would like to ask you to make sure that the discussion isn't such that I'm in the center, right? So I'm just part of the community, right? So it would be much more productive if we all talk with each other. Yeah, so my point, as I see here, is to raise some points to sort of kick off the discussion. Okay, so let me share my screen first. And okay, is everyone good now? Can we start? Okay, very good. So, charting Azerbaijan's future, lessons from ADER and emerging challenges. So, a quick roadmap. First, I want to touch upon a little bit about ADER's aspirations, achievements, and setbacks. Then I'll briefly talk about ADER in relation to modern Azerbaijan, but I want to devote significant amount of time to economic, environmental, and political challenges that modern-day Republic of Azerbaijan is facing. And in doing so, we are sort of looking back at the aspirations, if not dreams, of the founding fathers of ADER. And finally, I will touch upon briefly about the role of high-skilled Western-educated diaspora, such as yourselves. So, first, what were the key aspirations of ADER founders? I am pretty sure that all of you are aware, know quite a bit about ADER, its history, its context, and so on. For me, the key aspirations of founders were first and foremost national sovereignty. Now, this needs to be understood in the context of the time. One thing you might want to remember is that some of the key figures were actually initially socialists. Rasulzadeh, for example, was a socialist in the beginning, and he kept the socialist views, but very early on, in early 20th century, he understood that socialism without national inequalities is not realistic, meaning even if socialism is achieved, there will always be national ethnic inequalities that are persisting. And so then he changed his mind, and then one of the core ideas of Musavat and other members of intellectual and ruling elites of Adair was national sovereignty. Second, democratic governance, particularly parliamentary republic and universal suffrage. The third key principle, I would say, it was secularism. So separating religious and state institutions. Another major aspect was enlightenment. So we can call it different names, we can call it educational reforms, and so on. But enlightenment was a very important part of Adair's aspirations, and in fact, its legacy. Final key principle was multiculturalism. Part of it had to do with the context within which Adair was born, part of which had to do with the ideologies of key elite members of Adair. Now, what were the achievements and setbacks? So on the achievement side, it was indeed first parliamentary republic in the Muslim world. So it is important to note, to put the accent on parliamentary republic. So as we know, generally parliamentary versus presidential republics are better at ensuring minority rights and generally closer to what we call democracy. Second, which is also very well known, is universal suffrage, including voting rights for women. Third achievement was they did establish state institutions. They were weak, but they were independent. There was a national army built from basically scratch, from the ground up, and they tried to push some educational reforms and at least left the legacy of Baku State University. Another achievement was taking censorship of media and having free media in the society. Again, for a Muslim, extremely burdened, Muslim society, extremely burdened by the legacy of colonialism, having free media was a major achievement. Having a parliamentary republic was a major achievement. And the final thing is, while we cannot say that their foreign policy goals were achieved, in fact, some of the founding fathers, such as Topçu, if you know about his history, he basically died in exile without having seen a tiny part of his dreams come true. But Adair did secure in January 2020 international recognition. There were some British, French, and so on. So both the Allies and the Entente. But there were clear setbacks as well. One, weak state institutions. Second, very weak military. Third, which will come back because it's one of the threads that continues, it's weak human capital. Basically, Adair had major problems filling the state institutions with qualified personnel, qualified people with high enough integrity. Then there was major internal splits. So thinking about Adair as sort of as a coherent, or its government as a one coherent unitary system is not realistic. It's not historically accurate. There were major internal splits. In fact, there were 5 cabinet changes, not counting sort of intermediate changes within cabinets. In the course of 23 months, 5 cabinet changes is quite a lot. But we need to understand this against the tough geopolitical environment that they were facing. Extremely dynamic. I will give you I will refresh your memory rather with a couple of visuals, and of course major territorial disputes. Right. So all throughout its borders, it had major territorial disputes. Now, to give you a general idea, if you look at this map, so this is a map where the location of different controlling groups is shown. So if you look at the bottom left corner, you see territory effectively controlled by, and then there are Entente and pro-Entente forces, Turks and pro-Turkish forces, Germans and pro-German forces, yellow, Soviet and pro-Soviet forces, in rose, in pink color, and no neutral or no effective control. So now you can see in the top right corner, you see Azerbaijan, right? And then now look around, inside and around Azerbaijan, how many different forces, different political forces, and different military forces were active. And if you look at the bottom right corner, it notes isolated, the map notes isolated enclaves. And if you see, number one is Russian Mugan. So that's in the south of the Republic of Azerbaijan, the south of the northern Azerbaijan, right? So there was a short-lived mutiny by Russian settlers with some Azerbaijani collaborators. And then there was Armenian Republic in the west, and then there were Armenian forces under Andranik around modern-day southern Armenia / Zangezur. And then there was Mountainous Karabakh, right? Nagorno-Karabakh, Dağlık Karabakh. And then there was Assyria Armenian forces under Aga Petros. Yeah, number 5, you can see, right? Down near the Lake Urmia. And number 6, Jangali guerrillas under Küçük Khan. So you can see how dynamic and how violent the environment was when Adair was established. And if you look at this map, the following map shows the territorial disputes that Adair inherited. And you can see there was territorial disputes between Georgia and Armenia, between Georgia and Russia, between Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Mountaineer Republic, modern-day part of Dagestan. Then there was Georgia-Azerbaijan border disputes, more violent Armenia-Azerbaijan disputes, less violent but still important Georgia-Armenia-Azerbaijan disputes, and so on. Right? So you can see, and some of them were low-level conflict, and some of them were a bit more violent. Yeah? So this is the Adair's context. So this is important to note, to understand the setbacks and have nuance before blaming Adair leaders for failures and so on. Now, to look at briefly at Adair and versus modern Azerbaijan's context. So there are some similarities that persist. One is both units, both countries have hostile geopolitical environment. And so we right now it's relatively stable, relatively non-volatile, but it is still hostile, right? So the only proven strategic ally is Turkey, right? This is obvious. And for now, Georgia. With the rest, including Caspian Sea, where we had issues with Turkmenistan, where there were issues with Iran in delimiting the Caspian Sea. So this is a hostile geopolitical environment. Second, struggle for sovereignty and territorial integrity. So this was more the case during Adair than now, but still both of those issues persisted then and are they pose threats now as well. Alliance with Turkey was there and is now, and there is still dire need in high-skilled human capital. This is something, again, that comes back again and again. And at subtle level, there were then and are now entrenched cultural prejudices. There is Orientalism outside of Azerbaijan, against Azerbaijan, but there's also auto-Orientalism. Right? So this is internalized Orientalism of at least some group of Azerbaijanis, if not many Azerbaijanis. Those are internalized views regarding yourself and your culture, regarding your culture as backward, exotic, irrational, emotional, mysterious. Now, when it comes to differences, modern Azerbaijan is stable, yet extremely centralized state, unlike Adair. Adair had unstable, yet democratic governance. Modern Azerbaijan's foreign policy, which during Heydar Aliyev was dubbed multi-vector foreign policy, succeeded. So some people were blaming successive Azerbaijani governments for not aligning themselves clearly with one side, but apparently, as we see today, I would say it has succeeded. This multi-vector foreign policy of sort of navigating between different political and geopolitical forces relatively unscathed. And then modern Azerbaijan succeeded in sovereignty. This was very difficult, but we can say for now it has succeeded. Yet aspirations of democratic governance and enlightenment that their intellectual ruling elites had is not fulfilled yet. The same for, and enlightenment that I mentioned. Now, generally in the last, since regaining its independence, there have been some positive developments that cannot remain unmentioned. So one, you can see that over time, life expectancy at birth has sort of very slightly improved. Human capital measured through established measures is also relatively higher than before. We'll come back to that. Infant mortality rate has declined significantly, and GDP per capita has increased considerably. Of course, with a caveat that most of the GDP per capita was driven by oil and gas revenues. Now, we need to understand this sort of the situation that we have right now, not as a status quo that persist, but something that has to persist, that has to invest in sort of reproducing itself against a very difficult internal and external environment. Now, what are the problems that I see? So what are the key issues? At the cost of simplifying. Now, first, I will touch upon current political challenges. The reason I touch political challenges is because political challenges are most of the time the bottlenecks for solving other economic, environmental, social, public health problems. Right? So the first one is the strengthening the strengthening the rule of law, right? And then in doing so, chasing Singaporean model over United Arab Emirates model. So this is really important if we are serious about economic diversification, about renewable energy transition, about agricultural growth, and so on. Second, very clear, reducing corruption. On some petty levels, corruption has been reduced, but it has not been eliminated at all. Another issue, which again pervades the political and particularly economic system, is patrimonialism. Now, some of these problems have their roots in that same tough external environment, right? So it is very difficult to succeed when you are surrounded by two hostile large countries, being Russia and Iran, having had a very violent conflict and many other issues. Right? So balancing relations with Russia, the West, and regional powers is one of the major challenges. Armenia, Russia, and Iran are weak and inward-oriented, but I would say it's temporary. The lessons of ADR help us understand this, right? So ADR was established against the background of weakening Russia. It took only 23 months for that situation to change. If we were sitting in 1918, what would some people say? Oh, they would say, oh, Russia is disintegrating, Russia is collapsing. And indeed, it was. But it didn't take a long time, and it passed through agonies of civil war on various fronts, but it came back, and it came back to stay. So we should not forget that. And the same with Iran, right? So Iran at that point was weak and inward oriented, and it is now, relatively. But that can change. Now, what are current economic challenges? So those are sort of related. One is oil is declining. That's very clear. Reserves are diminishing quickly, but also the prices are likely to be volatile given the renewable energy transition. Gas is coming up, so there are new fields found, for example, by BP, but those are limited reserves and those are mature fields. So gas revenues are not likely to fill the coffers of the state to compensate for the loss of revenue for oil. Diversification, economic diversification, is high in ambition but low in implementation for various reasons that we can talk about. Now, in terms of Azerbaijan's ambitions, which were highlighted in the roadmaps, in several roadmaps from 2016, one is becoming a transport hub, another is renewable energy, right? Production of renewable energy, another is tourism, and ICT was also mentioned. And note that there can be different suspicions about why these sectors and not others. I would say that perhaps it's because these are politically less disruptive, meaning they're less disruptive for the economic status quo, and that is why these routes are passed. Those are seen as relatively low-hanging fruit, but we can talk about whether they are low-hanging. For example, renewable energy. Renewable energy has been declared as one of the important objectives for Azerbaijan, and in fact, I think it is good development that Azerbaijan will host the COP gathering later this year. But if you look realistically, Azerbaijan has lacked investment in renewables, and 8%, the renewable energy constitutes only 8% of consumption, and only 1.3% of that total consumption comes from wind and solar power. Agriculture is another avenue to go, but we need to remember that agriculture is low value added. It has high corruption still, and there is climate pressure, which I will touch upon in a couple of minutes. So there are irrigation issues that are coming, major irrigation issues. There are major issues with rainfall that are going to undermine agriculture if the business as usual model persists. What are some of the bottlenecks? One, economic patrimonialism. So it's a highly centralized economic decision-making. State-owned enterprises. There are between 12 and 14 enterprises, if I remember correctly, state-owned enterprises. I'm not talking about holding companies. I'm not talking about conglomerates, but I'm talking about specifically state-owned companies. Few of them are run decently. Many of them are run very inefficiently. And only small and medium-sized enterprise sector constitutes, their assets are about 2% of the GDP, if I recall correctly. Whereas in many other countries, comparable countries, small and medium-sized enterprises are the backbone of the economy. Now, economic complexity of export basket can tell us, can put Azerbaijan in a context, right? So if we compare it to countries based on similar export profiles, we see that, so we have Azerbaijan, Chile, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Norway, and Venezuela. And we look at the complexity of economic baskets, and we see that Azerbaijan is doing, in this comparison, is doing better only to Nigeria, which is another country that has been hampered since its existence by the legacy, like the extremely dark legacy of colonialism. So there is a lot to do to, in fact, achieve export diversification for Azerbaijan's products. Now, one thing is prioritizing agriculture. So despite the problems that exist, one way of thinking is, look, the room for diversifying economically is closing fast because climate change is coming. Renewable energy production is difficult. Tourism is not such a big source of revenue, especially for if you compare Azerbaijan to Georgia or other countries. Azerbaijan has lost the prime mover advantage, right? So it started late, it started with higher prices, and it's very difficult to start when you don't have the prime mover advantage, if you don't have the infrastructure, if you don't have cheap enough prices for tourists to come. Resolving the Dağlık-Karabakh problem is a major boost in that regard to enable tourism, right? But it's not big enough to actually bring numbers up so much. It's also one of the few, agriculture is also one of the few sectors that are feasible to develop. So because Azerbaijan did have some infrastructure prior to concentrating on oil and gas. During oil and gas industrialization, Azerbaijan, many traditional sectors suffered. That's a phenomenon called Dutch disease. Some of you might be familiar with. So agriculture was hit by Dutch disease as well in Azerbaijan, but it still has some basic infrastructure that is feasible to develop further. Now, an important point is that whether we want it or not, agriculture is also an avenue to reduce major food insecurity. Azerbaijan, largely due to oil and gas revenues, Azerbaijan has also become import dependent. So it imports major staples as well, for example, wheat. So if we want to have food security in the next 2-3 decades, we need to develop our own agriculture. Currently, it's 8% of GDP, but it employs 36% of the labor force, which is a large group of number. More than a third of the country's labor force is employed there. And one of the sort of recent sort of successes was that horticulture has been booming. Now, one of the important things is, I would say, given climate change induced troubles that we see coming, Azerbaijan might need to aim for higher value, more resilient, and more export competitive crops. So things like almonds, tea might be possible. We cannot grow avocados, for example. Those are some of the higher value, more resilient, export competitive, but we can look into what others are there. And I'm sure, so one caveat I would put is that from my meetings and from my knowledge with various government stakeholders, there is enough, right now, there is enough capacity in some sectors to enable implementing some of these ideas. There are enough people in various ministries, for example, who understand these things. The question is, can they push through the agenda? And can they develop these ideas further? Now, many of the issues come back to the current environmental challenges. So one major basic issue that I suspect Azerbaijan has is a major lack of awareness on climate change. COP meeting is likely to change it somewhat, but I doubt it will change it so drastically as to make people and various stakeholders from government to various business stakeholders to understand just how big the climate change can be in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan, luckily, is in the middle category of being exposed to climate change. But the problem is its capacity to adapt, its capacity to mitigate is I think that train has already gone, right? It's very difficult to mitigate. The capacity to adapt is not so strong yet. The climate change will likely have major negative impact on agriculture and through that on food security. There are already signs that I will show in several maps. Water scarcity, particularly fresh water, lack of infrastructure for water management. Climate change will also limit energy independence. And rising temperatures and extreme weather events will have a strong impact on, for example, labor productivity, right, across all sectors, and will increase various crises that need to be tackled, and public resources will have to be spent on that. Now, a couple of maps to suggest some ideas, right? So if you see, for example, at this map, it's a mud flow and landslide high-risk zones in the South Caucasus. You can see that Azerbaijan's northeast has both mud flow and landslide high-risk zones. And similarly, we have these same issues, especially landslides in Dağlık Karabakh, and in lower parts of Karabakh, we have mud flow risks, and we have major mud flow and landslide issues in Nakhchivan. Another problem is floods and avalanches. So luckily, avalanches may not be so present in Azerbaijan compared to Georgia, right? Because we don't have such high mountain ranges, but we do have it in some part of the country. But we do have major flood issues in several areas. You can see it along the western Caspian coast and along the lower part of the Kura River. So those are some of the important points that we need to pay attention to. Now, to look at the issue of potential impact of climate change in the South Caucasus holistically, again, there are some not very pleasing news. One is flash floods, we mentioned already, potential inundation area due to sea level rise that you can see along the Caspian coast. But there's also water depletion issues in the mid-north. Now, there's also major land degradation and desertification issues. If you look west from Absheron Peninsula, we don't have glacier problem, but we do have another major risk, and that needs to be very seriously considered, and that is spread of malaria. So you can see spread of malaria if you look at the lower part, right, where Araz and Kür intersection is. You can see there is a high risk of malaria there, but there's also high risk of malaria in Sunik province in Armenia, where Megri is, you can see there. And there's also high risk in the region of Georgia that is bordering Azerbaijan. So malaria risk should not be considered lightly. This is extremely important risk for economic and social development. Another last slide, I would say, on this is, if you look at the effect of climate change on crop yields in the 2040s in the South Caucasus. So if you focus only on Azerbaijan and you look at the zone in orange that was considered for this study. This is an agricultural region that was studied. And if you look at the bottom part, you can see that there are expected, under any scenario, whether it's a base scenario, low impact scenario, medium impact scenario, or high impact scenario, wheat, all crops from wheat, corn, potato, right? Grape, we can expect their production to be significantly reduced due to the problems that we just described. And if you look at the index of vulnerability to climate change, you can see that Azerbaijan, although its exposure to climate change and sensitivity to climate change is not the highest, right? So if you compare it to, for example, Tajikistan, Albania, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Turkey, it is less sensitive. And less exposed, but the adaptive capacity is among the lowest. Now, finally, to finish with some thoughts about the role for high-skilled Western educated diaspora. Yeah? So one caveat that I would put, one caveat is that the role of the high-skilled Western educated will depend on one's context, motives, resources, constraints. So different people are embedded in completely different social context, political context, economic context. Some people can afford engaging, some people cannot afford engaging. So I've studied in my previous work, I've studied Ukrainian migrants in 15 countries and Polish migrants in several different countries. And I've also looked at Azerbaijani diasporas. I haven't studied it academically, but I've looked at it. I've studied it to some extent. Motivations, resource constraints are vastly different. The second and major caveat is that the role of high-skilled Western educated diaspora depends significantly on the long-term vision and goodwill of Azerbaijan's elites. Now, a few general notes. One I would note is what are the things that might need to be done a bit better. One of the tough ones, one of the very difficult ones, partly due to diaspora, but largely due to Azerbaijan's ruling elites. One issue is contextualized engagement in democracy, rule of law, and economic development. What I mean by contextualized engagement is there are a usual way of promoting democracy, rule of law is to say, hey, look, Norway does this, why don't you do the same? Oh, hey, I live in this country, look how beautiful it is. They have this, right? And cite a number of institutions that are working well and so on. People go to vote and institutions change and say, oh, why Azerbaijan doesn't do the same? This engagement, the motives are understandable, maybe understandable sometimes, at least, but most of the time they're not contextualized, right? So serious people in Azerbaijan's government and other stakeholders, what I mean serious people with high enough integrity, right? These people look at such advice and say, and shrug their shoulders for a good reason and say, tell me something new, tell me something that I do not know. What they mean is, so these models might be working in A, B, C countries, but they're not working here, sometimes for a good reason, often for bad reasons, right, that we are very aware of, right? Clientelistic networks, corruption, and so on. But sometimes you need to understand deeper structures. Okay, so contextualized engagement. What is also possible, but not so feasible to do, is trans-cleavage diaspora network. So reaching out. So my experience with diasporas of different nations in different countries is that most of the time, the diaspora groups are, except relatively younger generations, are reproducing similar cleavages, similar sort of divisions as in the home country. So trans-cleavage diaspora networks have the capacity to sort of influence positively their country a bit better. A bit more feasible thing is a trans-organizational network mapping and action. I can sort of elaborate on this. I'm putting it in general terms. I can elaborate on this if needed. And four, and very important, is amplifying urgency and drive action on climate change. Now, one particular area where I think the high-skilled diaspora can be helpful is strengthening human capital. One is investing in and mentoring local startups and businesses. So the business climate in Azerbaijan is less than optimal, but sometimes local startups and businesses, most of the time, they face problems with entry to the market, right? Although there have been some positive reforms to that end, but many of them have major human capital issues. They have low know-how, right? They do not have enough people with good enough knowledge. Another is remitting, similar idea is remitting innovative practice in technology, healthcare, and education through maybe joint research projects, curriculum development, and guest lectures. And fostering educational cultural exchange schemes. So many of you, if not all of you, have perhaps benefited from some of those educational cultural exchange schemes in the past and know the value of it, right? So this is not earth-shattering experience, but it does help. And one other important point that sort of informs many others, that is sort of the substrata, the layer of many problems, is addressing cultural structures, this extremely strongly embedded cultural, social, psychological problems that inhibit Azerbaijan's development, particularly outside. Right? As we saw during the Second Karabakh War, mass media in Western countries, societies in Western countries were extremely biased. And it was extremely difficult for us to do something with that, right? So now, one thing I would suggest we need to do is striking a balance between decolonization and modernization. So we need to decolonize deeply, quite deeply in our minds, but we also need elements of modernization, right? Another issue is studying Orientalism, to tackle it while promoting cultural modernization. So we see Orientalism and auto-Orientalism outside and inside Azerbaijan, but sort of shedding away this sort of the cult of the white man template, for example, does not mean that we cannot and should not benefit from certain elements in cultural modernization. And one note I would make is that current decolonization, also beware of jumping on the bandwagon of decolonization, right? So one thing, for example, is missing it. It can learn a lot from previous waves. For example, I see decolonization literature and discussions. Most of the time, they miss works from the 1970s, right? And also deeper actual colonial struggles in Asia, in Africa, Latin America, including Azerbaijan. And finally, one simple note I would say is like sometimes maybe living a wholesome, fulfilling life is a form of cultural ambassadorship. So if you live a wholesome, fulfilling life yourself, you might be already a good cultural ambassador, if you so wish. I stop here. I took more time than I expected, but I think that the usual caveat that always works in such presentations that always sort of happens. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to a discussion. I'll stop sharing now, and I hope Nazreen can moderate. Please, Nazreen.
Thank you so much. That was an incredibly fascinating discussion. We moved through 100 years of history as well as looking into the future within the span of 45 minutes. We do have quite a lot of questions from both from the registration process as well as the Q&A here, and as well as a few of our own. I'll actually hand it over to Zulfiya so she can get started on moderating some of the questions.
Thank you again so much for this amazing presentation. Yeah, we had a lot of questions. Hopefully we'll have time to answer most of them. So one of the first ones was about the capital, Baku, and about how it's like developed beyond any other region in the country and that it is overpopulated. So the question was that what could be done in the next steps in distributing opportunities evenly, and so that we can encourage development in like all the regions steadily. And I think this might also be going back to when you touched upon the topic agriculture. Yeah, so what can we do next to make sure that all of our regions are developing?
I'll try to keep it brief, but obviously, so there were some ideas in the previous decades, not in the last years, as far as I'm aware, but in the previous decades there was an idea of, for example, moving some government agencies to Ganja, right, and maybe some to Sumgait, right, and so on. I think now there is actually an imperative to do that, right? I would say, given the climate change impact and the maps that I showed, and the fact that Absheron Peninsula developed largely, if not exclusively, because of the oil and gas revenues, and those are going down, basically the key imperative for developing Absheron Peninsula is no longer there. In fact, the imperatives are pushing towards the different regions. And there, of course, it's more difficult to do than to say this. But considering what government agencies can realistically be moved to Ganja, right, given the distance. For example, one of the issues, some maybe to Sumgait, right? Some maybe to Shaki, some maybe to Lankaran, right? And some maybe to Shusha, right, or Khankandi. So one of the problems of doing that, for example, when it came to the discussions about moving to some agencies, government agencies to Ganja, was that there was the Karabakh War, a conflict basically potential, right? That and we saw during the war that Armenian missiles could easily reach Ganja when they need it. Now that risk is much lower and hopefully will stay lower, then that issue is taken care of, right? So then it becomes more feasible to actually do that. But also now that agriculture, as you noted, and whoever asked the question rightly spotted that given that agriculture is becoming, it's not a luxury choice to engage developing it. It becomes a necessity to develop to just ensure food security. And if agricultural zones in Azerbaijan are largely outside Absheron Peninsula, then it becomes important and feasible to actually move some of this elsewhere. And again, we can be very proud that Azerbaijan is a great country and so on, but the truth is a small country. It is a small country. And with high-speed trains, traveling a few hours within the country is not a problem anymore. Yeah, and hopefully the sort of the southern route, the what Azerbaijan terms Zangezur corridor, if that works, that will be another impetus, right? So we have the train line, the working rail line going sort of through Iran, and then reaching Yevlakh, Ganja, Gazakh, and so on, and developing the southern route can also help. Yeah? So this are just my general notes on this. So I think the important thing is this: it's a bloated government, and moving several ministries, or at least some agencies, to Ganja and to Sumgayit and to Lankaran and maybe Shaki. The problem with Shaki is a high sort of, it's on the higher altitude, so getting there and back is a bit difficult, but it's possible. But Kabbalah and so on, those are possibilities. So it's about looking at what is feasible to get out. So for example, in the country where I live, Amsterdam is the political it's the country's capital, but the political capital is The Hague, which is an hour's drive. But in fact, several government agencies are located in completely different areas. So the reason is, for example, the State Bureau of Statistics, which is a very well working large government agency, is in a very southern part of the country, which is no less than 2.5 hours drive from here. But it employs a lot of people there, and people who are employed elsewhere have an incentive to go there. And what that means is that they will spend their money there, right? They will bring their children there, and their children will need to go to kindergarten there, right? So you basically have, positive spillovers. You have sort of, what is called forward linkage economy. So those are just some small notes.
Thank you so much. We had another question about the weaknesses of countries that you mentioned that they are temporary. For example, for Russia, it was. And the question is that, do you think the weakness of Iran is temporary? And what prospective developments in Iran would allow it to regain a position of economic and political challenge? I think you are muted.
I think the problem with dynamic, extremely multi-actor systems is that they're hard to predict. I would say impossible. Most of the social science is retrospective. When it tries to be prospective, when it tries to forecast, it often fails, and fails miserably. For example, very few social scientists, if any, predicted the fall of the Soviet Union. But how did the Soviet Union fall? Right? No one predicted right? Like it took like a couple of years, right? So perestroika, glasnost, and so on were all there, but no one in the West, which was very seriously sort of invested in Soviet Union collapsing, did not foresee that. What I'm trying to say, and the same is when it was 1999, no one foresaw that Putin's Russia will be so strong and so violent, right? But it became only a few years from then. So what I'm trying to say, so what in Iran can happen? But let's not forget that Iran, the modern regime of Iran is different from the history of Iran, right? And is different from economic production and human resources that Iran still has, right? Despite all odds, it still has those resources, right? It's a large country which is quite dependent on petrol revenues, but not so dependent as to be wiped off. It has other sectors of the economy. It is still surviving, right? Despite all the sanctions, despite continuous, it still functions, and it functions to the extent of basically sponsoring various major violent movements elsewhere. So how? There has to be something, right? And it has the benefit of having long history of statehood, right? Almost uninterrupted. What it means is that, yes, dynasties come and change, but there is a large strata within institutions and bureaucracies that continues to go. These people rarely change. As a colleague in Georgia said, yes, she said, Saakashvili's and Ivanishvili's come and go. Those under deputy minister bureaucrats, they stay. Those are the backbone of institutions, economies, and so on. And Iran still has that for good or bad. Yeah? So for many oppressed minorities, it is bad. But for the state stability, it is good. So I would say petrol revenues should be so drastically low, and much more sanctions need to be in place, and many more peoples inside inside Iran should be sort of rebelling against the unitary government for Iran to have major internal political struggles. Right? Without those, I don't see it coming. But again, I'm speculating, right? My caveat was it's very highly unpredictable. One thing about sanctions to note is, well, sanctions have a lot of loopholes, right? So sanctioning Russia, for example, is giving little fruit, as now very widely understood, right? The same happened with Iran. So there was Iran-Libya Sanctions Act in 1993, 1995. Several years later, it was found out that various American companies were finding very innovative ways of sort of bypassing those sanctions. Just like Russians are discovering those bypasses through the help of various entrepreneurs and government entrepreneurs in neighboring countries.
Thank you. We had another question about the human capital in Azerbaijan during the ADR period and today. Has there been a historical movement of talent between South and North Azerbaijan? How can we attract talent from South Azerbaijan to the North to drive economic progress? I think we can't hear you.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Why? Because, in fact, I remember, and that shows that I'm a little bit older than many of you. In fact, there was a movement from the northern Iran, in other terms, South Azerbaijan, to the Republic of Azerbaijan in 1990s. And many of them were ethnic Azerbaijanis who were they were intellectuals often, not always. They were also entrepreneurs. The major problem with some of them, there were several problems, not with these people, but Iran saw them as a threat. So what happened is Iran, which had an embassy, which is funny, Iran's embassy in Baku was a relatively small place, but apparently it had a staff of, in 1990s, it had a staff of 200 people. And I was wondering how a small embassy like this can host 200 people. The answer was that many of them were sort of basically attached intelligence officers, because the population of ethnic Azerbaijanis who in Iran's government's view could cause trouble, these people were present in large numbers in Baku. But only a few of them stayed, because at least at that time, Azerbaijan's government could not accommodate them, right? It accommodated some of them, but not many. Second is some of these people also did not stay long because they looked at the Republic of Azerbaijan as a springboard to go elsewhere, right? So they ended up in Western Europe, particularly in asylum-friendly countries, from Scandinavia to other parts of Western Europe. Now the situation might have changed, but we should not forget this sort of, at least those two issues. Yes, for example, you can invite them, but how many are actually likely to come if they can? So why wouldn't they go to Turkey? Yeah. Why wouldn't they go to other developed countries? If they come to Azerbaijan, there needs to be a strong enough reason for them to come. Second, if they come, they need to come apolitical, right? They should not be, let's say, seen by Iran as a threat and then pushing Azerbaijan's government to sort of, of course, Azerbaijan's government can always say, no, thank you. But no.
Thank you. I'm gonna ask another question. So this one is about diaspora with capital and skill in investing and mentoring local startups and businesses. And the question is that given the prevalence of Georgia and the foreign agent law in current use, and the fact that this law does exist in Azerbaijan, how effectively and easily can Azerbaijanis abroad invest in SMEs?
It's a good question. But look at the foreign agents law and where it applies, right? Meaning what kind of organizations is it applied to, right? Does it apply to non-commercial and commercial organizations alike, right? Does it apply to non-profits only, right? What are the possibilities for joint ventures, and so on and so forth? Yeah. So this is my short answer to that question, if it makes any sense.
All right. We have another question about Lake Urmia in Iran. So our audience has some concerns about the dying Lake Urmia, and they want to know, they know that this has severe impacts on South Azerbaijan, but they wonder what impact it could have on North Azerbaijan and whether actions are being taken to address it. Is this topic discussed at all in North Azerbaijan?
Regrettably, I'm not so well equipped and knowledgeable about either the topic of Urmia or the discussions in Azerbaijan. It hasn't come my way, so I'm not aware of any visible public discussions of the problem and its potential repercussions. One thing I would definitely say is, look, this is one of the things that I was trying to hint at, right? Given the shortage of time, climate change induced effects vary in their in their triggers, right? So, for example, in Bangladesh, you have around 25 million internal displaced people due to the climate change impacts, right? Largely, by the way, owing to industrialization by Western countries, largely. So you're talking about internally displaced people, but you're also talking about refugees, right? So if major problem, and Urmia is not a small lake, right? If there are significant numbers of refugees, where are they going to go? Can Iran accommodate them? Are these going to be internally displaced people, or some of them, given their ethnicity, will seek other places? And then for them, number one, for example, one of the points is Turkey, and the other is Azerbaijan. So what I'm trying to say is, if it's not discussed, maybe the person who asked this question might actually write something about it and put it on the agenda, saying like, look, this is another problem, right? This should be aware, because what I'm trying to say is many people still do not understand that for climate change crisis, borders that we have drawn in our minds and then physically on our paper maps do not exist. And the same with the locations of people. Yes, they might sort of come to a border with the border guards, but we saw in late 1980s and early 1990s that crossing Araz Riva is not so difficult after all.
Thank you so much. We'll have 10 more minutes of questions. If you have any more questions, put them in the Q&A, and we will continue with the questions that we already have. So we had a question about, although your focus on migrant networks focuses on the case of Poland, what can you say about Azerbaijan's diaspora? What differentiates from other diaspora groups that would be useful in understanding its possibilities, limitations, and effectivity on its ambitions?
Yeah, so I've studied Polish migrants, but I think mostly I've studied Ukrainian migrants. In my migration studies work, I've studied Ukrainian migrants with a colleague, Gwen Sasse. There are some similarities. The major similarity that we find in Ukrainian and Polish, and in my observations in Azerbaijani diaspora as well, depending on the country, is that the cleavages, meaning divisions inside the country in Azerbaijan, are more or less mimicked by the diasporas. What I mean is, for example, what we found and wrote our papers on in the case of Ukrainian and Polish migrants is that, for example, Ukrainian migrants in 15 different countries controlling for other things, they voted as if they were in Ukraine. So they voted for candidates that were not necessarily from their socioeconomic class. They were not necessarily from education, but the strong predictor was which region of Ukraine they were coming from. So if you know some demographics and socioeconomic divisions in Ukraine, you have the East, you have the West, and you have the middle, right? And those were not just ethnic, but also socioeconomic identity sort of maps. And the same is in Poland. It's a bit different. And what we found in the case of Ukrainian and Polish migrants is that they vote and politically behave as if they were in the home country. What this finding tells is that thinking about migrants as this sort of amorphous group of people, thinking about them as transnational agents of political change, especially democratic change, is premature. Meaning someone from a certain part of Azerbaijan comes out, right, and travels and studies somewhere else, there's no guarantee that they will shed away this regional affiliations, regional identities. We do find that there are some factors that sort of mitigate this, right? That they, so for example, one is the country where they go. So diaspora, including high-skilled diaspora of Azerbaijanis in the United States, is very different from the diaspora and high-skilled diaspora in Russia or Ukraine, because you're talking about very different sort of people who started from very different starting points. Yeah? So, for example, in Azerbaijani diaspora in Russia, the regional divisions, regionalist cleavages, right? Yerli bazlık, let's call it, is much, much stronger than I have seen among Azerbaijanis in North America and Western Europe, although they do exist here as well, right? They're not so visible, right? but they still exist. So those are some of the points. If I
Thank you. We had a question about the obvious elephant in the room. It's about how do you see the future of Azerbaijan-Armenia and Turkey-Armenia relationship? Will working with Armenia be more realistic and constructive moving forward? How will all involved actors deal with endless cycles of territorial claims?
Let me, so again, I'm going to speculate because as I warned you before, is social science has a hard time forecasting, right? For good reasons, right? Whoever tells you the opposite is either a genius or they don't know what they're doing. I would start with the second part of the question. I don't think those disputes will end in the foreseeable future, right? The claims, because you need to understand that in the context of, look, it's part of historiography already. It's part of this histories that these people have written and rewritten. Moreover, the historiography isn't contained to geographic Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. It has traveled well beyond. There are large constituencies, not only of ethnic Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Georgians, elsewhere, but there are libraries filled, and there are people, right, Westerners, who have vested interests in producing and reproducing certain discourses and ideas and so on. Those things don't go away quickly, right? So let me illustrate. Some time ago, I discovered this absolutely magnificent book. I think it's called Islam in the West, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a work of sort of masterful scholarship, right? It's boring at times for an ordinary sort of mind, for lay people, which I understand, but it's extremely meticulous. The point, if I can draw one point out of it, is that it shows how monastic discourses supported in Western Europe, supported by powerful political constituencies in those countries, how they rehashed initial prejudices about the Islamic people up until now. So that the thread that started from some monk writing how, Prophet Muhammad was, this and that, and, he had the many wives, so therefore he had like this, immense issues and so on. This sort of the thread, the subtle cultural and social psychological threads continue today. They come in different forms. They adapt to the times. They take new lexicons. They take new vocabularies. But if you look deeper, they are still there. The same with Orientalism. When Edward Said wrote his book, he wrote about largely 19th century sort of Orientalists who looked at the Middle East as basically like exotic, mysterious, irrational, dark sort of creatures who therefore need to be ruled by the rational, systematic, and so on and so forth. And he detected this work among the cultural workers, right? Starting from some of the less visible figures to some very visible figures, right? Gustave Flaubert, who writes beautiful, is one of the best sort of realist novelists of all time. He was an Orientalist in mind. Now, you look today, there is neo-Orientalism, right? It comes in different shapes and forms. It employs or sort of the Orientals themselves become the reproducers of this, the successful entrepreneurs. A kid who grow up, that Iranian writer, on whose book they made the animation, right? Or some others. So what I'm trying to say is those threads, they continue. So these border disputes are likely to stay. Now, the question is how to manage them. And I think that is one of the things that Azerbaijan's government, in my view, got right. And it was blamed for it especially during the Second Karabakh War. They were seen as basically doing realpolitik, right? Like basically unabashed, pragmatic, very simple, straightforward realpolitik, right? Like all this rhetoric about like, this and that, it doesn't matter. It's all this. It's all very clear, right? The goal is for us to take this land and take it by force. We had 20 plus years, 25 years of discussions, various commissions and so on. It doesn't work. Forget about it. So what I'm tending to think is that that is the path that the ruling elites in Azerbaijan have chosen, right? That basically say like all this sort of rhetoric of, yeah, so you need to just go back to like simple realpolitik. Yeah? What that means is these countries are likely to, definitely Azerbaijan and to some extent Armenia, when it can, will likely keep their military spending high enough. Azerbaijan for a good reason and Armenia for a good reason. When they will be trading, they will be very careful, right? To trade in those things that cannot create a problem for you tomorrow, right? Enabling those opportunities that will not backfire tomorrow at yourself. Yeah, so for example, right now, Azerbaijan stresses the Zengezur corridor for rail line, partly for pragmatic reasons, partly for like purely financial reasons. And Armenia says, oh no, we give you security guarantees or open the upper line. Azerbaijani government, Azerbaijani elite saying, not really. So what I'm trying to say is this is sort of one of the small miniature cases in the longer term perspective to see how this game will be played. So both countries have a lot to benefit from economic cooperation, and there is more understanding of it now in Yerevan than it used to be. And Azerbaijan is, for good reasons, interested in Armenia's stability, is interested in regime stability of Armenia, and is interested in elite stability in Armenia, right? Because Prime Minister Pashinyan might have, and is still making a lot of mistakes, right? Sometimes he sort of says things he should not be saying according to Baku, but overall, his course is relatively more pragmatic given the circumstances. But again, as I said, this thing might be temporary, right? It's possible that he will be elected out of office. What's going to happen next, right? Which party is going to come back? If Russia regains large part of Ukraine and is back on its war machine, sort of, it's already a war machine economy. If it makes a comeback, what will that mean for what it calls near abroad, right? It already can make a comeback, very easy comeback, and it has shown that it can very easily come back to Georgia. What prevents it from claiming something more in Azerbaijan? What stops it from aligning, having better relations with Armenian government if Armenian government becomes more pro-Russian? So these things are relatively fluid, right? So what Azerbaijan can do is to basically fortify its defenses as much as possible. It's not building a Trumpian wall, but more in terms of what can be done politically, economically, socially, in order to sort of, sustain this sort of good momentum as much as possible.
Thank you so much. We know that, we've taken a lot of your time already. We don't mean to exhaust you. If you have time, there's one more interesting question from the audience that we would like to ask. and then we can wrap up. So this question is regarding the rationale behind hosting events such as COP29 or major athletic events, given the nature of the government may not align well with the values that these events appear to represent. So perhaps it seems evident that countries in Azerbaijan's situation may not prioritize climate change as much. So could this be seen as a form of conspicuous consumption? And what is the prestige and benefit of hosting such major events?
I think the question already has part of the answers. These are indeed, have been, right? Those events have been partly prestige driven, right? It is very clear, right? But we should not forget that they also have other sort of other sides. One side, which is good for government connected businesses, but not good for Azerbaijan's economy or society, is that these events create large opportunities for turning public funds into private assets. Okay, so government needs to build a stadium. Who is going to get the contract to build the stadium? Is it going to be a genuinely independent, autonomous company who actually can provide good quality, or is it going to be a connected company, right? A company that is in the network, right? Clientelist network, social network, whatever, but not meritocratically chosen. So that's another side. Now, third side of it, I would not put together those different events in one sort of, I wouldn't lump them together because they do have different motives, yet the third side that connects them, the third thread, is that they are seen as an opportunity to draw investment. Yeah, so foreign direct investors need to come and see and actually talk, right? You can try to do it at Davos in Switzerland, you can do it in this forum or this forum, or you can say, well, actually come here. So Formula One doesn't do that, right? But COP29 might be an opportunity to sort of get enough number of serious actors in one place to ignite a conversation that might result in desperately needed investment in renewable energy in Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan does have renewable energy potential, right? It has, I wouldn't say it vast superior, but it is relatively, I would say it's significant enough. It has potential for solar, it has potential for wind, right? Not so much water. So, but Azerbaijan has been waiting for investment, right? Partly for good reasons, partly because, it just wants to sort of, nudge other actors to invest in that, right? Saying like, oh, European Union, you want the renewable energy, come and invest. But partly because, look, the public, the money that Azerbaijan has in the state-owned fund, for example, looks big, but it's not that big to make the renewable energy transition. So COP29 is a bit different from Eurovision, for example, because it is an opportunity to actually invest in something that is important. So how much will this actually convert into change, into actual investment? I don't know. It depends on how well the COP is organized in terms of squeezing as much opportunities as out of it as possible. But I don't know how much of that will actually happen. But I can see the rationale. The rationale is, look, We know we have renewable energy potential. You want to develop. Now we are understanding, not so well, but we are becoming more aware that we actually need it because our oil and gas are running out. So we actually do need the investment. But hey, can you invest it? Can you bring the money? Because for the EU Commissioner for Energy, Kadri Simpson, said we have made renewable energy as a key part. We've made renewable energy a key part of our cooperation with Azerbaijan. That's a statement, right? It's a big statement, which basically means, look, we are desperate for energy. For now, we are very happy that you have natural gas and you can supply us and oil. Please do as much as possible. But in future, we need other types of energy, whatever you can provide. Can you provide renewable energy? Azerbaijan says, yes, I can provide 20 gigawatts, right? And then energy, you know, energy people say, well, please, let's consider some investment. So this is an opportunity to sort of, you know, turn that event into a forum for discussing realistic investment opportunities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Your insights are pragmatic and at the same time hopeful. This was a really wonderful talk and an enlightening Q&A session. Thank you to the participants as well for your amazing questions. Yeah, and biggest thanks to you for your time and for your efforts. It's great to see, you know, esteemed academics such as you representing us abroad and contributing your great insights. So thank you so much. I'll also stop the recording here. In the next few days, we'll send this out so you all can rewatch and share. But yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Nazreen and Arslan and Mohammed for organizing this. Was lovely. To put it in simple terms, I'm proud of you that you are there, that you are doing this work. I don't mean, you know, I'm not known for sugarcoating my words. So take it as it is, and I'm very good. I'm very glad to see others. I also recognize some names already. I will not say which ones. And I'm glad to see all of you here as well. So I have hoped to raise some points. I'm very aware that many of you are aware of those problems. I try to sort of, you know, add my 2 cents on this. And if we are serious about, let's put it this way, there's a look at it in not only altruistic terms, but also somewhat selfish terms, right? What I am concerned about increasingly, what I've been concerned about, and that's just like comes with age, is that when you go back to your homeland, hometown, home community, the more time passes, the less you recognize the place, right? And with the climate change, I am more and more concerned that that is going to be a bigger issue, right? And last point is, it is laudable to have compassion to every being. One thing to note, though, is that we are likely to always be pigeonholed, right? It's not the fate of Azerbaijanis only, but it's the fate of you know, living in a world where national identity precedes you, right? People put you in a box because your last name is such and such, right? So national identity precedes you, right? You're already pigeonholed even before you've started speaking. And that also means, for me, that marginalized communities and marginalized people in our country and in our part of the world will be even more marginalized, right? For no fault of their own. What I'm trying to say is they it is laudable to express and channel your compassion towards others, regardless of where they come from and so on. But in a system where nation states are defining features, I often don't understand when people channel a large part of that compassion to the home communities, home towns, home villages, home countries of their own, right? Because there is more affinity there, there's more spark. And I'm afraid that among the millions of people in our country, many will need more compassion given the challenges ahead. And we are among the lucky ones, or resourceful ones, maybe, right? That we've managed to make it. And also somewhat lucky ones. The circumstances worked for us, right? Hard work also worked, probably, but also circumstances worked. So it is legitimate to take care of yourself, take care of your close ones and so on, and live a simple, fulfilling life. But if you feel going out and sort of sharing your compassion, that part of the world, that place will be needing more of that in the near future. So that's what I was trying to sort of hint at a little bit. Again, I'm going to end now. So thank you very much for organizing this.
Thank you again. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Yeah, thank you. This is awesome.